The blood on the stage driver's shirt told Eleanor Zimmerman everything she needed to know about why the horses were running wild, but she did not have time to scream before the coach lurched sideways and threw her against the wooden wall hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. The year was 1876, and she had survived 22 years in Boston only to die on a mountain road outside Wallace, Idaho, where the pine trees grew so tall they seemed to hold up the sky itself. Through the small window, she could see the lead horse's eyes rolling white with terror, foam flying from its mouth as something had spooked the entire team beyond reason. The driver's body slumped forward in his seat, reins dragging uselessly as the stagecoach careened around a bend that seemed to drop off into nothing but air and distant valley floor. Eleanor grabbed the leather strap hanging from the ceiling and held on with both hands as her carpetbag flew across the compartment and smashed against the opposite door. She had left Boston 3 weeks ago with nothing but her belongings and a teaching position waiting for her in Wallace, a silver mining town that promised opportunity for those brave enough to seek it in the Idaho Territory. Her father had died 6 months earlier, leaving her with debts she could not pay, and a stepmother who made it clear that Eleanor's presence was no longer welcome in the house where she had grown up. The teaching position had seemed like divine providence, a chance to start fresh in a place where nobody knew about her family's financial ruin or the scandal that had followed her father's death when his business partners revealed the extent of his gambling losses. The coach hit something in the road, and for one terrifying moment, all 4 wheels left the ground. Eleanor's stomach lurched as they crashed back down, the impact rattling her teeth and sending fresh waves of pain through her shoulder where she had struck the wall. She could hear the horses screaming now, a sound she had never imagined horses could make, high and desperate and full of the kind of fear that spreads like wildfire. Whatever had frightened them was still out there, still chasing or threatening or simply existing in a way that overrode every instinct except the need to run. Through the window she caught a glimpse of movement on the road ahead, a massive shape emerging from the tree line with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. At first, her mind refused to process what she was seeing, because surely grizzly bears did not grow to such enormous size. Surely their shoulders were not as wide as a wagon. Surely their claws were not as long as her fingers. But there it was, galloping down the mountain road with its mouth open and its intentions clear, and the horses had every reason to run. The stagecoach tilted dangerously as the wheels on the left side lifted off the ground. Eleanor felt gravity shift, felt herself sliding toward the door that was now pointing at the sky, and she knew with absolute certainty that they were going to roll. She had time to think about her mother, dead these 10 years from consumption, and to wonder if there was an afterlife where they might meet again. She had time to regret every cautious decision she had ever made, every opportunity she had declined because it seemed too risky or improper. She had time to wish she had told Thomas Hartwell to go to hell when he had broken their engagement the moment her father's debts became public knowledge. Then a man appeared beside the lead horse, running so fast his long dark hair streamed behind him like a banner, and he launched himself at the animal's harness with the kind of reckless courage that Eleanor associated with storybook heroes rather than actual human beings. His hands closed around the leather straps, and he hauled back with visible effort, his boots digging into the dirt road as he used his own body weight as an anchor. The muscles in his arms and shoulders strained against his buckskin shirt, every line of his body radiating strength and determination. The horses fought him, too panicked to recognize help when it came, but the man held on. Eleanor watched through the window as he pulled himself hand over hand up the harness, getting closer to the bit and the animal's head, speaking words she could not hear over the thunder of hooves and the rattle of the coach. His face was weathered and tanned dark from sun and wind, with a strong jaw covered in several days of beard growth and eyes that remained focused on the task even as the bear closed the distance behind them. He reached the lead horse's head and grabbed the bridle with both hands, throwing his full weight backward. His feet skidded in the dirt, but he did not let go, and slowly, impossibly, the horse began to slow. The other 3 animals had no choice but to follow, their momentum dragging them forward, even as their leader fought against the reins. The coach lurched and swayed, and Eleanor felt the wheels on the left side crash back down to earth with an impact that sent fresh bruises blooming across her ribs. The man held the horses as they pranced and tossed their heads, their sides heaving and foam dripping from their mouths. He spoke in a low, steady voice that Eleanor could barely hear, a rumbling sound that seemed to cut through the animal's panic like a knife through butter. His hands never stopped moving, stroking and soothing even as he maintained his iron grip on the bridle. Behind them, the bear had stopped running, having apparently decided that easier prey existed elsewhere in these mountains, and it turned aside into the forest with a final huff of dismissal. Eleanor tried to stand, but her legs refused to cooperate, shaking so badly that she fell back onto the bench seat. Her hands trembled as she smoothed down her traveling dress, navy blue wool that was now covered in dust and marked with a tear at the shoulder seam. Her hat had fallen off at some point during the wild ride, and her dark hair was coming loose from its pins, curling around her face in a way that would have horrified her former finishing school instructors. The coach door opened, and the man stood there, backlit by the afternoon sun that filtered through the pine trees. He was even larger up close, easily over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to fill the entire doorway. His buckskin shirt stretched tight across a chest built from years of hard physical labor, and his arms showed the kind of muscle definition that came from swinging an axe or hauling traps through mountain snow. His hair fell past his shoulders, dark brown with threads of lighter color where the sun had touched it, and his eyes were a startling blue-green that reminded Eleanor of deep water. "Madam," he said, his voice carrying the rough edges of someone who spent more time talking to animals than people. "Are you hurt?" Eleanor opened her mouth to say she was fine, that Boston ladies did not fall apart over a little excitement, but what came out instead was a strange gasping sound that might have been a laugh or a sob or something in between. She pressed her hand to her mouth and tried again. "The driver," she managed. "I think he's been shot." The man's expression darkened, and he moved to the front of the coach with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in his own body. Eleanor heard him climb up to the driver's seat, heard the low curse that followed his examination. When he returned to the door, his face was grim. "Dead before the horses spooked," he said. "Bullet caught him in the chest. Probably bushwhackers waiting on the road, though they usually take more care with their aim." He studied her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. "Are you traveling alone?" "I was the only passenger," Eleanor said. Her voice sounded steadier now, though her hands still shook. "I'm going to Wallace to take a position as a schoolteacher." Something that might have been respect flickered across his face. "That's a long way to come for a teaching job. Boston, judging by your accent." "Is it that obvious?" "Out here, yes." He glanced back down the road where the bear had disappeared. "We need to move. That grizzly might decide to come back, and there could be more trouble if those bushwhackers are still around. Can you ride a horse?" Eleanor thought about the 3 times she had been on a horse in her entire life, all of them sedate walks through Boston Common on animals so tame they were practically dogs. "Not well," she admitted. "Then you will ride with me." He said it as a simple statement of fact, without any of the suggestive undertones that would have accompanied such a proposal in Boston society. "My horse is tied back in the trees. I will bring him around." He disappeared before Eleanor could argue, moving with surprising quiet for someone so large. She used the moment alone to take several deep breaths and try to compose herself. Her hands had finally stopped shaking, though whether that was from courage returning or simply shock setting in, she could not say. Through the window, she could see the dead driver slumped on his bench, and she looked away quickly. She had never seen a dead body before, had been carefully sheltered from such realities by her upbringing. The man returned, leading a massive bay horse that must have stood 17 hands high, with a chest like a barrel and legs thick with muscle. The horse eyed the Stagecoach team warily, but stood steady as its owner checked the saddle. He reached up to adjust something on the bridle, and Eleanor saw the play of muscle across his back and shoulders, the way his body moved with casual strength that spoke of a lifetime spent outdoors doing hard physical work. "What is your name?" she asked, because it seemed important to know before she trusted her life to him. He looked at her with those startling eyes. "Pierce Whitman. I trap and hunt in these mountains, have a cabin about 5 miles from Wallace." Eleanor Zimmerman. She gathered her skirts and tried to figure out how to exit the coach with some semblance of dignity. Pierce solved the problem by simply reaching in and lifting her down as though she weighed nothing at all. His hands spanned her waist easily, and for a moment she was close enough to smell pine sap and wood smoke and something else that was just him, masculine and wild. He set her on her feet and held her elbow until he was certain she had her balance. "Your bag?" "The brown carpet bag," Eleanor said, and watched as he retrieved it from where it had landed in the corner of the coach. He tied it to his saddle with quick, efficient movements, then turned to the stagecoach horses. In a matter of minutes he had them unhitched from the coach, their reins tied together to form a makeshift lead line. "Cannot leave them here," he explained. "They are valuable animals, and the company will want them back. We will take them with us to Wallace, let the sheriff know what happened here." He swung up onto his horse with an easy grace that Eleanor envied, then reached down for her. "Put your foot on mine and give me your hand." Eleanor did as instructed and found herself pulled up behind him on the horse as though she weighed no more than her carpet bag. She had to put her arms around his waist to keep from sliding off, her chest pressed against his broad back. Even through his shirt she could feel the heat of his body, the solid muscle that made him feel more like a wall than a person. "Hold tight," Pierce said, and clicked his tongue to set the horse moving. They rode in silence for the first mile, Pierce leading the 4 stagecoach horses behind them, while keeping his attention fixed on the road and the forest around them. Eleanor tried not to think about how improper this was, how she was pressed against a strange man in a way that would have caused a scandal if anyone from her old life could see. But this was not Boston, and the rules that had governed her life there seemed foolish and distant when measured against the reality of bears and bullets and mountain roads that dropped away into nothing. "How did you happen to be there?" she asked finally. "When the horses bolted, I mean." "Was checking my trap lines," Pierce said. His voice rumbled through his chest and back into her. "Heard the gunshot, then the horses screaming. Figured someone needed help." He glanced back at her, his profile strong and weathered. "Lucky I was close. That coach was about to roll, would have gone right over the edge where the road narrows." Eleanor shuddered at the mental image. "I thought we were going to die." Most people would have. It was not boasting, just statement of fact. Takes a certain kind of fool to jump in front of a team of runaway horses. "Then I'm grateful for fools." The words came out before she could stop them, warmer than she had intended. She felt him chuckle, a low rumble that traveled through his body into hers. "My ma always said I had more courage than sense. She died thinking I would end up killed by my own stubbornness." His voice carried an old grief, worn smooth by time. "That was 12 years ago, before my father and I came west. He is gone now, too, died 3 winters back when a tree fell wrong during a storm." "I am sorry," Eleanor said, and meant it. "I lost my mother when I was 12, my father 6 months ago. So you came west to start over." It was not a question. "A lot of people do that. This country does not care about what you were before, only what you can do now." They crested a rise, and Wallace spread out below them, a collection of wooden buildings clinging to the mountainside like barnacles on a ship. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and Eleanor could see the dark mouths of mine entrances dotting the surrounding hills. It was smaller than she had imagined, rougher, the kind of place where men outnumbered women 10 to 1, and civilization was a thin veneer over the raw reality of survival. "The school is on the east side of town," Pierce said, as though reading her thoughts. "Built it last year when enough families moved in to justify the expense. You will be the 3rd teacher they have had. The first one left after 2 weeks, said the children were too wild. The second one stayed 6 months, then married a mine supervisor and quit to keep house." "Are the children really so terrible?" Eleanor asked, feeling a flutter of anxiety in her stomach. "They are frontier children. They know how to shoot and ride and survive. But most of them cannot read beyond a 1st level or do sums past basic counting. You will have your work cut out for you." He paused. "But if you are brave enough to come this far from Boston, you might be brave enough to handle them." The town grew closer as they descended the mountain road. Eleanor could see people moving in the streets now, men mostly, wearing rough work clothes and gun belts. A few women moved between buildings, their dresses plain and practical compared to Eleanor's Boston finery. She suddenly felt very conscious of how out of place she looked, how her carefully pressed traveling dress and her useless hat marked her as an outsider. Pierce guided his horse down the main street, which was rutted with wagon tracks and dotted with piles of horse manure that nobody seemed inclined to clear away. The buildings were raw lumber, most unpainted, with false fronts that made them look larger than they really were. Signs advertised a general store, a saloon, a boarding house, a blacksmith, and various other businesses necessary to support a mining town. Men stopped what they were doing to stare as they passed, their eyes moving from Pierce to Eleanor to the string of stagecoach horses trailing behind. Pierce stopped in front of a building with a sign reading "Sheriff" and helped Eleanor dismount before swinging down himself. His hands on her waist were firm but impersonal, and he released her the moment her feet touched the ground. A man emerged from the building, wearing a tin star and a suspicious expression. "Pierce," the sheriff said, his eyes moving to the horses. "What have you got here?" Stage was hit by bushwhackers about 7 miles up the mountain road. Driver's dead, single bullet to the chest. The horses spooked and ran, nearly took the coach over the edge. Pierce's voice was flat, factual. "This lady was the only passenger. I brought the horses in and left the coach where it sits. You will want to send some men out to retrieve it and the driver's body." The sheriff's expression darkened. "Third stage hit this month. Those bastards are getting bold." He looked at Eleanor with something that might have been sympathy. "You are the new school teacher?" "Eleanor Zimmerman," she said, extending her hand automatically before remembering that frontier sheriffs might not observe Boston social niceties. But the man shook her hand anyway, his grip careful. "Frank Morrison. Welcome to Wallace, though I wish it were under better circumstances." He turned back to Pierce. "You see the men who did it?" "No. Heard the shot, then the horses. By the time I got there, the bushwhackers were gone. Might have been spooked by something, or maybe they figured one shot was enough warning. A grizzly came down the road after us. Could be they ran into it and decided to clear out." Morrison nodded slowly. "I will get a party together. Go out before dark. Can you show them where to find the coach?" "I can draw you a map." Pierce glanced at Eleanor. "Miss Zimmerman needs to get settled. Where is she supposed to stay?" "The boarding house, I expect. Mrs. Fletcher runs it, has a room set aside for the teacher." Morrison pointed down the street. 3 buildings down on the right, the one with the blue door." Pierce gathered the reins of his horse and the stage team. "I will get these animals to the livery, then draw your map. Come on. Miss Zimmerman, let me see you settled before I go." Eleanor wanted to say she could find her own way, that she did not need a mountain man escort for 3 buildings worth of walking. But the truth was that every man on the street was still staring, and the weight of their attention made her skin prickle with awareness of her own vulnerability. So she simply nodded and walked beside Pierce, her carpetbag in his hand and her pride in her throat. The boarding house was a 2-story structure that looked slightly more permanent than its neighbors, with actual glass in the windows and curtains visible behind them. Pierce knocked on the blue door, and it opened to reveal a woman in her 50s, plump and brisk, with sharp eyes that took in the situation immediately. "You are the new teacher," she said to Eleanor. Come in, come in. I heard the stage was due today." Her gaze moved to Pierce, and her expression warmed. "Hello, Pierce. Keeping out of trouble?" "Trouble found us today, Mrs. Fletcher. Stage was attacked, driver killed. I brought Miss Zimmerman in." He held out the carpetbag. "She will need that room you prepared." Mrs. Fletcher's hand flew to her mouth. "Lord have mercy. Are you hurt, dear?" "Bruised, but nothing serious," Eleanor said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, too controlled. "Mr. Whitman saved my life." "Then you were lucky Pierce was nearby. He has pulled more than one fool out of trouble in these mountains." Mrs. Fletcher took the carpetbag and ushered Eleanor inside. "Come along, you look ready to drop. I will get some hot water for washing, and there's stew on the stove if you are hungry." Pierce touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was almost courtly. "I will leave you in Mrs. Fletcher's care. She will see you right." He hesitated, his blue-green eyes searching Eleanor's face. "Welcome to Wallace, Miss Zimmerman. I hope your stay is less eventful from here on out." Then he was gone, striding back toward the livery with the horses trailing behind him. Eleanor watched through the window as he moved down the street, his long hair catching the afternoon light. Several people called greetings to him, which he returned with nods or brief words, but he did not stop moving until he disappeared around a corner. "That man is a legend in these parts," Mrs. Fletcher said from beside her. "Lives up in the mountains by himself most of the year, only comes to town for supplies or when someone needs help. They say he can track anything, bring down a bull elk at 200 yards, survive storms that would kill most men." She sniffed. "Also say he is too wild to ever settle down proper, but I think he is just waiting for the right reason to try." Eleanor turned away from the window, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. Every muscle ached from being thrown around the coach, and her hands were starting to show bruises where she had gripped the leather strap. "Could I see my room?" she asked. "I think I need to lie down." Mrs. Fletcher's expression softened. "Of course, dear. You have had a terrible shock. Come along." The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, a dresser, and a chair by the window. Bright curtains moved in the breeze from the mountains, carrying the scent of pine and something else Eleanor could not identify. Mrs. Fletcher set the carpetbag on the bed and promised to return with hot water and food. Left alone, Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed and let herself shake. The reality of how close she had come to death settled over her like a heavy blanket, making it hard to breathe. If Pierce had not been there, if he had been checking his traps a mile away instead of close enough to hear the gunshot, she would be dead now. The coach would have rolled over that cliff edge, and she would have died without ever seeing Wallace, without ever teaching a single student, without ever having the chance to build the new life she had come so far to find. She thought about Pierce's hands on the horses' bridles, the way his muscles had strained as he fought to stop them. She thought about being lifted onto his horse, as though she weighed nothing, about the solid warmth of his back against her chest during the ride to town. He was unlike any man she had ever known, raw and competent and completely uninterested in the social games that had dominated Boston society. He had saved her life as casually as another man might hold a door, then delivered her to safety and walked away without expecting thanks or reward. Mrs. Fletcher returned with a pitcher of hot water and a bowl of stew that smelled like heaven. Eleanor forced herself to eat, though she had no appetite, and then washed the dust from her face and hands. When she finally lay down on the bed, still wearing her dress because unpacking seemed beyond her abilities, sleep took her immediately. She dreamed of running horses and blue-green eyes and hands strong enough to stop a runaway team through sheer force of will. The next morning, Eleanor woke to sunlight streaming through her window and the sounds of a town coming to life outside. For a moment she could not remember where she was, and then everything came rushing back. The shooting, the wild ride, Pierce appearing like something out of a legend to save her. She sat up slowly, cataloging her aches and pains. Her shoulder was stiff where she had hit the wall. She had bruises on her ribs and arms, but nothing seemed seriously damaged. Someone knocked on her door, and Mrs. Fletcher's voice called, "Breakfast in 10 minutes if you want it hot." Eleanor called back her thanks and forced herself out of bed. Her carpetbag yielded a fresh dress, simpler than the one she had worn yesterday, and she did her best to make herself presentable. The mirror over the washstand showed a woman who looked older than 22, with shadows under her eyes and her dark hair refusing to stay pinned properly. She gave up trying for Boston perfection and settled for neat enough. Breakfast was served in a dining room that held 3 long tables. Eleanor found herself seated with 2 men who worked at one of the silver mines and a woman who introduced herself as the wife of the general store owner. They were all curious about the stage attack, and Eleanor found herself recounting the story while trying not to sound too dramatic. The miners listened with serious expressions, shaking their heads over the increasing boldness of the bushwhackers. "The sheriff will catch them eventually," one miner said. "He is a good man, does not let things slide." "And if the sheriff does not, Pierce Whitman will," the other miner added. "He does not take kindly to people attacking women or stealing from his neighbors. Tracked down the men who rustled cattle from the Patterson Ranch last year, brought them in tied over their saddles." "Were they dead?" Eleanor asked before she could stop herself. "Deed, near enough," the miner said with dark humor. "Pierce does not kill unless he has to, but he makes sure the message is clear. Do not mess with his mountains or his people." After breakfast, Eleanor presented herself to the school board chairman, a thin man named Albert Chen, who owned a stake in 3 different mines and took his civic duties seriously. He walked her to the schoolhouse, a sturdy building with a small bell tower and windows that let in good light. Inside, she found a wood stove, 20 desks of varying sizes, a teacher's desk, a blackboard, and shelves holding worn textbooks. "We have anywhere from 15 to 25 students on any given day, depending on weather and family needs," Albert explained. "Ages range from 6 to 15. Some can read a little, most cannot. You will need to split them into groups, teach multiple levels at once." He looked at her seriously. This is not an easy position, Miss Zimmerman. The children are good at heart, but they are not used to discipline or structure. The families are scattered over several square miles, so attendance is irregular. And some parents question whether education is worth the time when children could be working or helping at home. I understand, Eleanor said, though in truth, Boston had not prepared her for teaching in a one-room schoolhouse with students of wildly different ages and abilities. But she had not come all this way to fail. When do I start? Monday. That gives you the rest of the week to prepare. Albert handed her a key. The school is yours whenever you need it. There's a small library in town, such as it is, and you can order supplies through the general store if you need materials we do not have on hand. Eleanor spent the rest of the day at the school, going through the textbooks and trying to develop a plan for teaching multiple age groups simultaneously. It was challenging work that required all her concentration, which meant she did not have time to think about stagecoach robberies or mountain men with eyes like deep water. By the time the light faded and she had to return to the boarding house, she had the beginnings of a curriculum and a fierce determination to succeed. Friday brought a visit from the sheriff. He found Eleanor at the school and removed his hat as he entered. Miss Zimmerman, I wanted to let you know we recovered the coach and the driver's body yesterday evening. Found some tracks at the site, looks like 3 men on horses. We are following up on some leads. Did they take anything from the coach? Eleanor asked. The strong box was forced open, money gone. They also took the driver's gun and anything valuable he had on him. Morrison's expression was grim. It is getting worse out here. More men coming west looking for easy money, figuring the mining camps make good targets. I am doing what I can, but I am only one man with a few deputies. Eleanor thought about the long road between Wallace and the nearest town, how isolated they really were out here in the mountains. Is it safe for the stagecoach to run? As safe as it ever is, Morrison said. The company is hiring armed guards now, riding shotgun. It should help. He turned his hat in his hands. I'm sorry your introduction to Wallace was so rough. Most days this is a peaceful place, hard-working people trying to make something of themselves. I am not fragile, Sheriff, Eleanor said firmly. I came west knowing it would not be like Boston. I can handle rough. Morrison's face split into a smile. I believe you can. Pierce said you kept your head during the whole thing, did not panic even when the coach was about to roll. That takes steel. The mention of Pierce made Eleanor's heart skip in a way she did not want to examine. Has Mr. Whitman returned to his cabin? Headed back yesterday afternoon, after he helped track the bushwhackers as far as the creek. He does not like being in town long, says it makes him feel caged. Morrison settled his hat back on his head. But he will be back in a week or two for supplies. He always is. After the sheriff left, Eleanor tried to return to her lesson planning, but her concentration had fractured. She kept thinking about Pierce in his mountain cabin, alone with whatever thoughts occupied a man like that. Did he read? Did he play music? Did he sit by his fire at night and feel lonely? Or was he the kind of person who genuinely preferred solitude? She shook herself mentally. It was ridiculous to be thinking about a man she had spent perhaps 2 hours with, even if he had saved her life. Pierce Whitman was a mountain man, wild and untamed, exactly the sort of person her Boston upbringing had taught her to avoid. The fact that he was also brave and strong and had eyes that seemed to see right through her polite facades was irrelevant. Except it did not feel irrelevant. Saturday, Eleanor spent exploring Wallace, getting to know the town that would be her home. The general store had a remarkable variety of goods considering how remote they were, and the owner's wife, Martha Yang, was warm and welcoming. The assayer's office sat next to a surveyor, and both men tipped their hats as she passed. The saloon was doing brisk business even in the middle of the afternoon, and Eleanor gave it a wide berth, conscious of her reputation as the schoolteacher. She found the library in a small room attached to the church, a collection of perhaps 200 books maintained by the minister's wife. Eleanor introduced herself and spent a pleasant hour discussing literature and teaching methods. By the time she left, she had borrowed 3 books and felt she had made her first real friend in Wallace. Sunday, she attended church services, sitting in the back and observing her future students and their families. The children were indeed a rough lot, squirming and whispering and clearly uncomfortable in their Sunday clothes. But they were also bright-eyed and curious, craning their necks to get a better look at the new teacher. Eleanor met parents after the service, shaking hands and promising to do her best by their children. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and cool mountain air. Eleanor walked to the school an hour early, so nervous her hands shook as she unlocked the door. She had lesson plans for 3 different groups, primers ready for the youngest children, and a determination not to let her students see how terrified she really was. The children arrived in clusters, some walking from nearby houses, others delivered by parents on horseback. They filed into the school with varying degrees of enthusiasm, from eager curiosity to sullen resistance. Eleanor stood at the front of the room and introduced herself, then launched into the assessment she had planned to determine each child's ability level. The first day was chaos. The younger children could not sit still, the older ones tested her authority at every turn, and Eleanor discovered that classroom management was a skill Boston Normal School had barely touched on. By the time she rang the bell for dismissal at 3 in the afternoon, she was exhausted and questioning every decision that had brought her to Idaho. But she returned Tuesday and Wednesday, and by Friday she had established a routine and a set of rules that most of the children followed most of the time. She learned their names and their personalities, figured out which students were genuinely struggling and which were simply testing boundaries. She discovered that 10-year-old Michael Wong had a gift for mathematics, that 7-year-old Sarah Kowalski could not see the blackboard and needed to sit closer, that 13-year-old Daniel Murphy had been told he was stupid so many times he had stopped trying. Teaching was harder than anything Eleanor had ever done, and she fell into bed exhausted every night. But it was also satisfying in a way her life in Boston had never been. These children needed her, needed someone who believed they were capable of learning and growing. For the first time since her father's death, Eleanor felt like she was doing something that mattered. 2 weeks into her tenure, Pierce Whitman walked into the general store while Eleanor was buying supplies for the school. She saw him through the window first, riding down the main street on his massive bay horse with a string of pelts tied behind his saddle. Her heart did something complicated in her chest, and she had to take a deep breath before she could speak normally to Martha Yang. By the time Pierce entered the store, Eleanor had her composure back. He nodded to her, a slight smile crossing his weathered face. "Miss Zimmerman, how are you settling in?" "Very well, thank you." Eleanor was proud of how steady her voice sounded. "The teaching is challenging, but rewarding. I heard you survived the first week without running back to Boston. That makes you tougher than the last 2 teachers." He moved to the counter where Martha was already gathering supplies, clearly familiar with his usual order. "Any more trouble with the bushwhackers?" "The sheriff has not caught them yet, but there have been no more attacks." Eleanor watched as he examined a new hunting knife, testing the balance and edge with the practiced eye of someone who depended on his tools. "He said you helped track them." "To the creek, but they knew what they were doing. Split up, covered their trail. The sheriff has some ideas about who it might be. Men who have been seen hanging around the mining camps looking for easy marks." Pierce set the knife down and turned to face her fully. "I am glad you are staying. Wallace needs a school teacher who will not quit at the first sign of difficulty." There was respect in his voice, and something else Eleanor could not quite identify. She found herself wanting to prolong the conversation, to find some reason to keep him talking. "Do you ever wish you had more education, the ability to read and write?" "I can read and write," Pierce said mildly. "My mother was a school teacher back in Pennsylvania. She made sure I knew my letters and numbers before she died. I have a dozen books in my cabin that I read over and over through the winters." Eleanor felt her face heat with embarrassment. "I apologize. I should not have assumed." "No harm done. Most people figure a mountain man is just a step above a savage." There was no bitterness in his voice, just statement of fact. "But my mother believed education was the foundation of civilization, and she passed that belief to me. I may live rough, but I am not ignorant." "What books do you have?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious. "Shakespeare, mostly. The tragedies. Also some Homer, Byron's poetry, and a collection of essays by Emerson." Pierce's smile widened at her expression. "My mother had strong opinions about what literature was worth reading. I grew up with Hamlet and Achilles the way other boys grew up with dime novels." Eleanor laughed, delighted by this unexpected dimension to the man who had saved her life. "I grew up with Austen and the Brontes." "Different worlds," Pierce said. "But good stories are good stories, wherever they come from." He paid for his supplies and gathered the parcels. "I need to get back to my trap lines, but I will be in town again in a few weeks. Perhaps we could talk more about books then." "I would like that," Eleanor said, and meant it more than was probably wise. She watched him leave, his long strides carrying him quickly down the street to where his horse waited. Martha Yang made a knowing sound from behind the counter. "That man does not spend time talking to people unless he wants to. You made an impression." "He saved my life," Eleanor said. "I imagine that creates some sense of connection." "Pierce saves lives all the time," Martha replied. "He does not ask those people to discuss literature with him." She wrapped Eleanor's purchases in brown paper, her expression thoughtful. "He is a good man, Miss Zimmerman. Rough around the edges but solid where it counts. He would never hurt someone weaker, never take advantage. And he is loyal to the bone once he decides someone is worth protecting." Eleanor carried her parcels back to the boarding house, Martha's words echoing in her mind. She had not come to Idaho looking for romance, had not even been sure she wanted to risk her heart again after Thomas's betrayal. But there was something about Pierce Whitman that drew her, something that went beyond his physical strength or the fact that he had saved her from the runaway stage. He was genuine, in a way most people were not, completely comfortable with who he was and uninterested in pretending to be anything else. Over the next 3 weeks, Eleanor settled deeper into her life in Wallace. Her students made progress, slowly but surely. The older boys stopped testing her quite so aggressively, the younger children learned to stay in their seats for more than 5 minutes at a time, and Eleanor discovered she had a gift for making lessons interesting through stories and games. Parents began to thank her when they saw her in town, commenting on how their children were learning. She made friends with Martha Yang and the minister's wife, joined a small group of women who met weekly to sew and talk, and gradually stopped feeling like an outsider. Wallace was not Boston, with its theaters and museums and sophisticated society, but it had a warmth and directness that she found surprisingly appealing. People said what they meant here, helped their neighbors without expecting recognition, and judged others by their character rather than their pedigree. Pierce returned to town on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, when the aspens had turned gold and the air carried the first real bite of approaching winter. Eleanor was at the school, working at her desk while the children finished arithmetic problems, when she looked up to see him standing in the doorway. He filled the frame, his buckskin jacket dark with water from some mountain stream, his hair tied back with a leather cord. Every child in the room turned to look, and Eleanor heard several whispered exclamations. Pierce was clearly a figure of legend even among the young people of Wallace. He removed his hat and nodded to Eleanor. "Miss Zimmerman, forgive the interruption. I brought something for the school." He stepped aside and another man entered carrying a wooden crate. They set it on the floor near Eleanor's desk, and she saw it was filled with books, old books, their leather covers worn but still intact, their pages yellowed but readable. "Found them in an abandoned mining shack up near Copper Falls," Pierce explained. "Someone must have brought them west and left them behind when they moved on. Figured they would do more good here than gathering dust in an empty building." Eleanor knelt beside the crate, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted out the volumes. There were perhaps 30 books in total, a mix of classics and adventure novels, and even a few textbooks. "This is wonderful," she breathed. "The children have been desperate for more reading material." "Then they are yours." Pierce glanced around the classroom, his gaze taking in the neat rows of desks, the maps on the walls, the carefully written lessons on the blackboard. "You have done good work here. The place looks different than it did before you came." Pride warmed Eleanor's chest. "Thank you. That means a great deal coming from you." Their eyes met and held for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Eleanor was intensely aware of 23 students watching them with interest, and she forced herself to look away. "Would you like to stay for a reading? The children are almost finished with their arithmetic, and I was planning to read from Tom Sawyer." Pierce's smile was slow and genuine. "I would like that very much." He settled onto a chair at the back of the room, looking absurdly large on the child-sized furniture, and Eleanor returned to the front of the class. The children finished their problems with unusual speed, clearly excited to have a visitor, and then Eleanor opened Tom Sawyer to where they had left off the previous day. She had always loved reading aloud, had won a prize for dramatic interpretation at her finishing school, and she used every bit of skill she possessed to bring the story to life. The children listened raptly, laughing at Tom's antics and gasping at his narrow escapes. Eleanor occasionally glanced toward the back of the room and found Pierce equally absorbed, his blue-green eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. When she finally closed the book at the end of the chapter, several children groaned in disappointment. "Tomorrow," Eleanor promised. "Now, gather your things. Those of you who have completed your arithmetic may leave. Those who have not will stay until you finish." Most of the children filed out, though Eleanor noticed several of them stopped to stare at Pierce as they passed. He seemed comfortable with the attention, returning their curious looks with friendly nods. When the last student had departed, Eleanor turned to find him standing beside her desk. "You are a natural teacher," he said. "The way you brought that story alive kept their attention even after a long day. My mother would have approved." "That might be the highest compliment I've ever received," Eleanor said honestly. "Thank you for the books. You have no idea what a difference they will make." "I have some idea. My mother used to say that books were windows to places we could never go otherwise, ways to live lives we would never lead." Pierce moved closer, and Eleanor caught the scent of pine and leather and open air. "I was wondering if you might like to take a walk with me. There is something I want to show you, if you have time before dinner." Eleanor knew she should say no. A young unmarried woman did not go walking alone with a man, especially not with someone like Pierce Whitman, who seemed to embody everything wild and untamed about the frontier. But Boston rules felt very far away, and she found herself nodding. "Let me lock up the school." They walked through Wallace together. Pierce's long strides adjusted to match her shorter ones. People watched them pass with open curiosity, and Eleanor knew this would be the subject of conversation at tomorrow's sewing circle, but she could not bring herself to care. The afternoon was beautiful, the air crisp and clear, and she was walking beside a man who made her feel more alive than she had in years. Pierce led her to the edge of town and up a trail that wound through pine forest. The climb was steep enough to leave Eleanor breathing hard, but the view from the top made it worthwhile. Wallace spread out below them, small and fragile against the vast wilderness that surrounded it. Mountains rose in every direction, their peaks already dusted with snow, and the sky overhead was a blue so deep it seemed almost purple. "This is where I come when I need to remember why I live here," Pierce said quietly. "When town feels too crowded and I miss the silence of my cabin. Up here you can see how small we really are, how much bigger the world is than our little concerns." Eleanor turned in a slow circle, taking in the endless forest and the distant peaks. "It is beautiful and terrifying. So much space, so much wildness. That's why I love it." Pierce sat on a flat rock and gestured for her to join him. "In the city, everything is controlled, tamed, reduced to human size. Out here, the land is still itself, still wild. It demands respect, but it does not apologize for what it is." "Like you," Eleanor said before she could stop herself. His eyebrows rose. "You think I am wild and unapologetic? I think you are comfortable with who you are, in a way most people never achieve. You do not pretend or perform. You simply exist as Pierce Whitman, and that is enough." Eleanor felt heat climb her cheeks. "I hope that does not sound presumptuous. I barely know you." "You know me better than most people who have known me for years," Pierce said. His voice had gone quiet, serious. "Most people in Wallace see the mountain man, the legend who lives alone and does dangerous things. They do not see the person underneath, the one who still misses his mother's voice and his father's laugh, who reads Shakespeare by firelight and sometimes feels lonely enough to ache." The honesty in his words struck Eleanor like a physical blow. She reached out without thinking and placed her hand over his where it rested on his knee. His skin was warm and calloused, his fingers twice the size of hers. "I see you," she said softly. "Not the legend. You." Pierce turned his hand over, threading his fingers through hers. His grip was careful, as though he was afraid of crushing something fragile. "I've been coming to town more often than I need to," he admitted, "making excuses to visit, hoping to see you. That's not like me. I'm not the kind of man who chases after women." "What kind of man are you?" Eleanor asked, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "The kind who lives alone because he has never met anyone worth changing his life for. Until now." He met her eyes, and the vulnerability in his gaze made her breath catch. "You are different, Eleanor. You are brave and smart. and you do not need me to be anything except who I am. When I'm with you, I feel like maybe I could have more than just my cabin and my trap lines. Maybe I could have a real life with someone who understands why I need the mountains, but also needs me." Eleanor's throat tightened with emotion. No one had ever spoken to her like this, with such raw honesty and no attempt to hide behind pretty words or social conventions. "I was engaged once," she heard herself say, "to a man in Boston, someone my father approved of. He broke it off the moment my family lost our money, said he could not afford to marry someone without prospects. It hurt, but looking back, I think what hurt most was realizing he had never really seen me. He saw the daughter of a wealthy merchant, someone who would enhance his position in society. When that disappeared, so did his interest." "He was a fool," Pierce said flatly, "and you are well rid of him. I know that now, but it made me afraid to trust my own judgment, to believe that someone could want me for myself rather than what I represented." She tightened her grip on his hand. "You make me feel brave again, like maybe I can risk my heart and it will not destroy me if things go wrong." "I cannot promise I know how to do this," Pierce said. "I have never courted anyone, never tried to fit my life around another person's needs. I will probably make mistakes." "Then we will make them together." Eleanor smiled despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "I'm fairly certain I have no idea how to court a mountain man either. We will figure it out as we go." Pierce lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture so old-fashioned and courtly it made her heart flip over. "May I call on you properly? Take you to dinner, walk with you in the evenings when your teaching is done?" "I would like that very much." Eleanor felt like she was glowing from the inside out, lit up with a happiness she had almost forgotten existed. "Though I should warn you that Mrs. Fletcher will probably interrogate you mercilessly. She takes her role as my landlady very seriously." "I can handle Mrs. Fletcher," Pierce said with a grin. "I'm more worried about the school board chairman and the sheriff and every protective father in Wallace who has decided you are too valuable to lose to some wild mountain man." "Let them worry," Eleanor said recklessly. "I'm old enough to make my own decisions." They sat together on the rock as the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and deep purple. Pierce told her about his cabin, a small structure he had built with his own hands 5 miles into the mountains, near a creek that ran year-round. He described his trap lines and his hunts, the months he spent alone with only his thoughts, and the occasional visit from a curious deer or elk. Eleanor told him about Boston, about growing up in a world of rules and expectations, about her mother's death and her father's slow decline after it. She told him about the shock of discovering the debts, the humiliation of having their possessions sold to pay creditors, the cold calculation in Thomas's eyes when he realized she was no longer a good match. Pierce listened without interrupting, his hand warm around hers, and when she finished, he simply pulled her closer so that her head rested against his shoulder. "You are the strongest person I have ever met," he said quietly. "To survive all that and still be willing to risk yourself again, to come all the way out here and build a new life, most people would have given up." "I did not have a choice," Eleanor said. "It was this or become dependent on my stepmother's charity, and that would have killed me slowly. There is always a choice. You chose to fight, to take a chance on the unknown. That takes courage most people do not have." Pierce pressed a kiss to the top of her head, a gesture so tender it made Eleanor's eyes sting. "I am glad you made that choice. Glad the stage brought you here, even if it was the most terrifying ride of your life." "So am I," Eleanor whispered. They stayed on the mountain until the light began to fade, talking about everything and nothing, learning the shape of each other's thoughts. By the time Pierce walked Eleanor back to the boarding house, she felt like she had known him for years rather than hours. He left her at the Blue Door with a promise to return Thursday evening to take her to dinner at the hotel restaurant, the closest thing Wallace had to fine dining. Mrs. Fletcher met Eleanor in the hallway with knowing eyes and a smile. "That man is smitten with you, dear. I've never seen Pierce Whitman look at anyone the way he looks at you." "The feeling is mutual," Eleanor admitted, "though it is probably foolish. We barely know each other." "Sometimes the heart knows before the head catches up," Mrs. Fletcher said wisely. "My Henry proposed after 2 weeks of courtship, and we had 43 years together before he passed. When you find the right person, you know. Do not let fear talk you out of something real. Eleanor lay awake that night, her mind too full for sleep. She thought about Pierce's hands steadying the runaway horses, about his voice reading her students to sleep with Shakespeare's words, about the vulnerability in his eyes when he admitted he was lonely. She thought about how alive she felt when he was near, how the careful walls she had built around her heart seemed to dissolve in his presence. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The next 2 days passed with agonizing slowness. Eleanor taught her classes, met with parents, prepared lessons, but part of her mind was always on Thursday evening and the promise of dinner with Pierce. She changed her dress 3 times before settling on a dark green wool that brought out the color of her eyes, then spent longer than necessary arranging her hair. Mrs. Fletcher watched these preparations with maternal approval and did not comment on the obvious nerves. Pierce arrived exactly on time, dressed in dark trousers and a white shirt that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the bronze of his skin. He had trimmed his beard and tied his hair back, making an obvious effort to look civilized. But nothing could hide the essential wildness about him, the sense that he belonged to the mountains rather than to any town. They walked to the hotel together through the cool evening air. Wallace was settling in for the night, lamplight glowing from windows and the sound of piano music drifting from the saloon. The hotel dining room was simple but clean, with checkered tablecloths and waitresses who knew everyone by name. Pierce held Eleanor's chair for her, a gesture that reminded her again of the education and refinement his mother had insisted upon. Over a dinner of venison stew and fresh bread, they talked more about their lives and their dreams. Pierce told her about his plan to expand his trap lines before winter set in, about the new cabin he wanted to build with better insulation and more room. Eleanor talked about her students' progress, about her hope to start a proper library for the school, about her dream of seeing every child in Wallace able to read and write fluently. "What would you need for this library?" Pierce asked, his eyes thoughtful. "Books, mostly. Money to buy them, since donations only go so far. Shelves to hold them, a system for tracking who has borrowed what." Eleanor smiled ruefully. "It is an ambitious project for a teacher in her first year. I should probably wait until I'm more established. Or you should do it now, while you still have the energy and optimism of a newcomer." Pierce leaned back in his chair, considering. "I could build the shelves, good sturdy pine that will last for years. And I know some book dealers in Denver who might give a discount if we are buying for a school." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest. "You would do that?" "I told you my mother believed in education. This would be a way to honor her memory, help make sure other children have the opportunities she wanted for everyone." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Besides, I like seeing you excited about something. Your whole face lights up when you talk about teaching." They lingered over dinner until the waitress began giving them pointed looks, then walked slowly back through the darkening streets. Pierce kept Eleanor's hand tucked into the crook of his arm, his presence solid and reassuring beside her. At the boarding house door, he stopped, looking down at her with an expression that made her breath catch. "May I kiss you?" he asked quietly. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. Pierce cupped her face in his hands, his palms rough but gentle, and lowered his head slowly enough that she could have pulled away if she wanted. But she did not want to pull away. She wanted this, wanted him, with an intensity that surprised her. His lips met hers in a kiss that started soft and questioning, then deepened as Eleanor rose on her toes and wound her arms around his neck. Pierce made a low sound in his throat and pulled her closer, his arms banding around her waist. The kiss went on, passionate and sweet and full of promise, until Eleanor's knees felt weak and her heart was racing like a runaway horse. When they finally broke apart, Pierce rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing hard. "I should go," he said, though he made no move to release her, "before I forget to be a gentleman." "I like when you forget," Eleanor said daringly, and felt his laugh rumble through his chest. "You are trouble, Eleanor Zimmerman, the best kind of trouble." He kissed her once more, quick and hard, then stepped back. "I will see you Saturday? There's a dance at the town hall. I am not much for dancing, but I would be honored if you would go with me." "Yes," Eleanor said immediately. "I would love to." She watched him walk away into the night, his long strides carrying him quickly out of sight. Inside, Mrs. Fletcher was waiting with hot tea and a smile. That looked like a successful evening. It was perfect, Eleanor said, touching her lips where Pierce's kiss still seemed to linger. He is perfect. No man is perfect, dear, but some come close enough that it does not matter. Mrs. Fletcher poured tea into 2 cups. Pierce has been alone a long time. He will need patience as he learns how to be part of a couple. And you will need to decide how much of his lifestyle you can accept, because he will never be a town man who comes home for dinner every evening. I know, Eleanor said, but I do not want him to change who he is. I want him exactly as he is, wild and free and choosing to share his life with me. Then you have a better understanding than most, Mrs. Fletcher said approvingly. Saturday's dance was a major social event, with families coming in from outlying ranches and mining claims to enjoy an evening of music and community. The town hall was decorated with pine boughs and lit by dozens of lanterns, and a 4-piece band provided music for dancing. Eleanor wore her best dress, a deep blue silk she had packed from Boston, and arrived on Pierce's arm feeling like the luckiest woman in Idaho territory. Pierce was clearly uncomfortable in the crowded hall, his shoulders tense and his eyes constantly tracking the room. But he asked Eleanor to dance, and did his best to keep up with the reels and waltzes, his natural grace compensating for his lack of practice. Other men cut in, as was customary at these events, and Eleanor found herself passed from partner to partner. But her eyes always found Pierce, standing at the edge of the crowd with a cup of punch, watching her with an intensity that made her skin tingle. During a break in the music, Pierce pulled her outside onto the porch where the air was cooler and they could hear each other speak. "Having fun?" he asked. "Yes, though I keep wishing everyone else would disappear so it was just us." Eleanor leaned against the railing, grateful for the breeze. "You look like you are planning an escape route." "I'm not fond of crowds," Pierce admitted. "Too many people, too much noise. It sets my teeth on edge after about an hour." He moved to stand beside her, his arm brushing hers. "But I would endure a lot worse to spend an evening with you." Eleanor turned to face him, studying his profile in the lamplight. "What if I wanted to see your cabin? Would you take me there?" Pierce went very still. That would not be proper. A young woman alone with a man in the wilderness, no chaperone. "I am aware of the impropriety," Eleanor said dryly, "but I want to see where you live, understand that part of your life, and I trust you to behave as a gentleman." "It is not me I am worried about," Pierce said, his voice rough. "Every time I am near you, I want to kiss you again, touch you, claim you in ways that would ruin your reputation if anyone found out. Taking you to my cabin would be testing self-control I am not sure I possess." Heat flooded Eleanor's face, but she held his gaze. "Then we will be strong together." "But I mean it, Pierce. I want to see your world, not just the parts of it that fit into Wallace society." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Next Sunday, if the weather holds. I will take you to my cabin for the afternoon. But we tell Mrs. Fletcher where we are going, and I have you back before dark. Agreed?" "Agreed," Eleanor said, and sealed it with a kiss that left them both breathless. The next week passed in a blur of teaching and preparation. Eleanor told Mrs. Fletcher about the planned visit to Pierce's cabin, enduring the older woman's lecture about propriety and consequences with good grace. But Mrs. Fletcher ultimately gave her blessing, acknowledging that times were different in the frontier, and young people needed some freedom to build relationships. Sunday dawned clear and cold, with frost sparkling on the ground and breath misting in the air. Pierce arrived after church services, dressed in his usual buckskin and leading 2 horses. Eleanor had borrowed a split riding skirt from Martha Yang, and Pierce taught her the basics of controlling a horse while they were still in sight of town. The ride to his cabin took nearly 2 hours, climbing steadily into mountains that grew more rugged and beautiful with every mile. Pierce pointed out landmarks and signs of wildlife, teaching her to read the forest the way he did. They saw elk grazing in a meadow, a hawk circling overhead, and fresh bear tracks in the mud near a stream. Eleanor felt simultaneously exhilarated and terrified by the vast wilderness surrounding them. Pierce's cabin sat in a small clearing beside a creek, surrounded by towering pines. It was larger than Eleanor had expected, a solid log structure with a stone chimney and real glass in the windows. Inside, she found one large room with a sleeping area on a raised platform at one end, a cooking area with a wood stove, a table and chairs, and shelves holding supplies and books. Everything was neat and organized, surprisingly civilized for a bachelor living alone. "You built all this yourself?" Eleanor asked, running her hand over the smooth surface of the table. "With my father's help initially. After he died, I added the loft and improved the chimney." Pierce lit a fire in the stove, his movements practiced and efficient. "It is not much compared to what you grew up with in Boston." "It is beautiful," Eleanor said honestly. "Solid and real and perfectly suited to its place. I love it." Pride flickered across Pierce's face. He showed her his books, his traps hanging on the wall, the furs he had tanned and was preparing to sell. He made coffee and they sat at his table, looking out the window at the creek rushing past. Eleanor felt a peace settle over her that she had not experienced in years, a sense of rightness that went beyond words. "I could live here," she said quietly. "Not year-round, not with my teaching responsibilities, but in the summers or on weekends. This place is not as foreign to me as you might think." Pierce set down his coffee cup, his eyes searching her face. "What are you saying, Eleanor?" "I'm saying that when I imagine my future, you are in it. You and this cabin and this life, balanced with my teaching and my students in Wallace." She took a breath, gathering courage. "I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other 2 months. But I also know that I have never felt this way about anyone, and I do not want to waste time pretending otherwise." Pierce moved around the table and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "I love you," he said simply. "I think I loved you from the moment I saw you in that stagecoach, refusing to panic even though you were terrified. You are brave and smart and beautiful, and you make me want things I never thought I could have." Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks. "I love you too. It is insane and reckless and completely unlike me, but it is true." He kissed her then, pulling her down from the chair and into his arms. They ended up on the thick furs before the fire, kissing until Eleanor's lips were swollen and her hair had come completely loose from its pins. Pierce's hands roamed her back and waist, careful but hungry, and Eleanor felt an answering hunger rise in herself that she had never experienced before. "We have to stop," Pierce said raggedly, pulling back. His eyes were dark with desire, and his breathing was ragged. "Eleanor, we have to stop now or I will not be able to." She knew he was right, knew they had already crossed lines that decent society would disapprove of, but it took all her willpower to sit up and begin repinning her hair with shaking hands. Pierce watched her with an expression of such longing it made her chest ache. "Marry me," he said abruptly. "I know it is too soon. I know you need time. But I want you to know my intentions are honorable. I want to build a life with you, Eleanor. Find a way to balance your teaching with my trapping. Create something that works for both of us." Eleanor's hands stilled. She looked at this man, this rough mountain man who read Shakespeare and built cabins and had stopped runaway horses with his bare hands to save her life. She thought about Thomas, who had valued her connections more than her character, and about the safe, boring future she might have had if her father's business had not failed. Then she thought about waking up beside Pierce, spending her summers in this cabin learning the rhythms of the wilderness, raising children who were equally comfortable with books and bow hunting. She thought about building a library in Wallace and watching her students grow into educated adults while knowing she had a partner who supported her dreams as fiercely as she supported his. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Pierce's face split into a grin of pure joy. He swept her up and spun her around the cabin, both of them laughing like children. When he finally set her down, he kissed her again, slower and deeper, sealing the promise between them. They rode back to Wallace in the late afternoon, holding hands whenever the trail was wide enough for the horses to walk side by side. At the edge of town, Pierce stopped and turned serious. "I have nothing to offer you except myself and that cabin. I have some money saved from selling furs, but I will never be wealthy. You would have to keep teaching if you want any security." "I want to keep teaching," Eleanor said firmly, "and you offer me everything that matters, love, respect, partnership. That is more than most women ever get." They announced their engagement that evening, to Mrs. Fletcher's delight and the surprise of most of Wallace. The sheriff shook Pierce's hand and told him he was a lucky man. Martha Yang hugged Eleanor and promised to help plan a wedding. Parents of Eleanor's students congratulated her, clearly pleased that she was putting down roots in their community. Only the school board chairman looked concerned. "You will continue teaching after marriage?" Albert Chen asked carefully. "Absolutely," Eleanor said. "My husband supports my career completely." Albert's expression cleared. "Then congratulations. We would have hated to lose you." The wedding was held in early December, just before the heavy snows closed the mountain passes. The entire town turned out for the ceremony in the small church, and Eleanor walked down the aisle in a simple cream-colored dress borrowed from Martha Yang. Pierce waited at the altar looking uncomfortable in his formal clothes, but utterly focused on Eleanor, his eyes never leaving her face. They spoke their vows in steady voices, promising to love and honor each other through whatever challenges the frontier life might bring. The minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Pierce kissed Eleanor with the enthusiasm that brought laughter from the assembled guests. The reception was held in the town hall, with food provided by half the families in Wallace, and dancing that went on until midnight. Eleanor danced with her new husband, with the sheriff, with several of her students' fathers, and felt embraced by her adopted community in a way she had never experienced in Boston. These people had accepted her, supported her, and were now celebrating her happiness with genuine warmth. Pierce and Eleanor spent their wedding night at the boarding house in Eleanor's small room that seemed even smaller with Pierce's large frame filling it. He was gentle and patient, understanding that this was new territory for Eleanor, and taking time to make sure she felt safe and cherished. When they finally came together, it was with a tenderness that brought tears to Eleanor's eyes, a joining that felt both physical and spiritual. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Pierce's arms wrapped around Eleanor and her head on his chest. "I never thought I could be this happy," he said quietly. "Never imagined finding someone who could love both sides of me, the mountain man and the person underneath." "You're not two different people," Eleanor said. "You're just Pierce, complex and whole, and I love all of you." Winter closed in hard that year, with snows that buried Wallace under drifts taller than a man. Pierce stayed in town more than usual, unwilling to leave Eleanor for extended periods. He found work helping clear snow from roofs and haul supplies for families who could not manage on their own. In the evenings, he and Eleanor sat by the fire in their room, reading aloud to each other or simply talking about their plans for the future. Eleanor continued teaching through the winter, arriving at school early to stoke the fire and make sure the building was warm enough for her students. She started the library project with Pierce's help, building shelves along one wall of the schoolhouse and putting out word that donations of books would be gratefully accepted. The response was better than she had hoped, with families bringing in volumes they had carried west and no longer needed. Pierce proved to be a natural with children and sometimes stopped by the school to help with projects that required muscle or building skills. Eleanor's students adored him, peppering him with questions about hunting and trapping and life in the wilderness. He answered with patience and humor, treating even the youngest children with respect. In February, Eleanor realized she was pregnant. She told Pierce on a snowy evening when they were alone in their room, and watched his face cycle through surprise, joy, and fear in rapid succession. "Are you frightened?" he asked, pulling her close. "Mom?" "A little," Eleanor admitted, "but mostly excited. I want a family with you, Pierce. Children who grow up knowing they are loved and can be anything they choose." "They will have the best mother in Idaho territory," Pierce said fiercely, "and I will do everything in my power to keep all of you safe." The baby was born in late September, a healthy boy with dark hair and his father's blue-green eyes. They named him William, after Pierce's father, and Pierce cried when he held his son for the first time. Eleanor watched her rough mountain man cradle the tiny baby with infinite care, and felt her heart might burst from love. She took a month off from teaching after William's birth, and Martha Yang filled in as substitute teacher. But Eleanor was eager to return to her students, and Mrs. Fletcher agreed to watch William during school hours. Pierce built a cradle that could be brought to the schoolhouse so Eleanor could feed the baby during lunch break without having to leave her post. Life settled into a rhythm that worked for their unusual family. During the school year, Pierce stayed mostly in Wallace, trapping the nearby areas and helping with odd jobs around town. Summers he, Eleanor, and William spent at the mountain cabin, where Eleanor read, and Pierce taught their son about the wilderness. As William grew older, he proved to be a perfect blend of his parents, equally comfortable with books and the outdoors. 2 years after William was born, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter they named Catherine, after her own mother. She had Pierce's coloring but Eleanor's features, and she was as fearless as her brother. The cabin had to be expanded to accommodate the growing family, and Pierce built a second room and a proper loft with Eleanor's help. The school in Wallace flourished under Eleanor's continued leadership. Her students went on to become teachers themselves, successful merchants, even a lawyer who returned to help establish proper courts in Idaho territory. The library grew until it rivaled collections in much larger towns, and families came from miles around to borrow books. Pierce never lost his love of the wilderness, but he also never missed an important moment in his children's lives. He was there when William took his first steps, when Catherine said her first word, when both children started school under their mother's teaching. He built them sleds for winter and took them fishing in summer, taught them to read animal tracks and identify edible plants. Eleanor never regretted leaving Boston or the life she might have had there. The frontier gave her purpose, love, and a partnership that fulfilled her in ways she had not known were possible. On their 10th wedding anniversary, she and Pierce sat on the porch of their cabin, watching William and Catherine play by the creek, and reflected on the journey that had brought them together. "Do you ever wish you had married someone more conventional?" Eleanor asked. "Someone who could stay home and be a traditional wife?" Pierce pulled her close and kissed her temple. "Never. You are the only woman who could have made me want this life, made me believe I could be more than just a man alone in the mountains. You gave me purpose beyond survival, and you have never asked me to be anything except myself." "That goes both ways," Eleanor said. "You let me be strong and independent while still making me feel cherished and protected. Not many men could balance that." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. William had just turned 11, Catherine was 9, and there was another baby on the way. Life was full and busy and sometimes chaotic, but it was theirs, built with love and compromise and absolute trust. 20 years after the Stagecoach incident that brought them together, Pierce and Eleanor had 4 children and had become pillars of the Wallace community. William worked as a guide for hunting parties while studying law by correspondence. Catherine was following her mother's footsteps, training to be a teacher. The 2 younger children, James and Margaret, were still in school but showing promise in their own interests. The school Eleanor had nurtured had grown into a proper academy with 3 teachers and over 60 students. The library she had started now occupied its own building and served the entire region. Pierce had been appointed as a deputy sheriff, using his tracking skills and wilderness knowledge to help maintain order across a vast territory. They still spent summers at the cabin, though now it was large enough to house their entire extended family when children and grandchildren came to visit. Pierce had slowed down a little, his hair shot through with silver, but he was still strong and capable. Eleanor had laugh lines around her eyes and a few strands of gray in her dark hair, but she could still command a classroom with a single look. On a warm June evening, they walked together up the trail to the overlook where Pierce had first told Eleanor he loved her. The view was unchanged, Wallace still small against the vast wilderness, mountains still rising in eternal majesty toward the sky. "I was thinking about that day on the Stagecoach," Eleanor said. "How terrified I was, how certain I was going to die. If someone had told me then that the man who saved me would become my husband, the father of my children, my partner in every way that mattered, I would have thought they were mad." "I knew," Pierce said with a smile. "The moment I saw you refusing to panic, holding on with everything you had, I knew you were someone special. I just had to convince you to take a chance on a wild mountain man." "Best decision I ever made," Eleanor said, and kissed him there on the mountain as the sun set, and their life together stretched before them, full of love and joy and the kind of happiness that only comes from finding exactly the right person to walk beside. Their children grew and started families of their own, building lives that honored both their parents' strengths. William became a prominent lawyer who fought for mining rights and land protection. Catherine opened a school in Boise that became known throughout the territory. James took over Pierce's traplines and guide business, expanding it into a successful outfitting company. Margaret became a writer, documenting frontier life and her family's story for future generations. Pierce and Eleanor grew old together in their mountain cabin, surrounded by children and grandchildren who adored them. They were the couple everyone pointed to as an example of what marriage could be, partners who never lost their individual identities while building something greater together. On their 40th anniversary, the whole family gathered at the cabin for a celebration. 4 children, 12 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren filled the clearing with noise and laughter. Pierce stood with his arm around Eleanor, watching the chaos with contentment. "We did good," he said quietly. "We did better than good," Eleanor corrected. "We built something real and lasting, a family, a community, a legacy." That night, after everyone had settled down to sleep in various corners of the cabin and surrounding tents, Pierce and Eleanor lay together in their bed and talked about the life they had shared. They remembered the fear and excitement of those early days, the challenges they had overcome, the compromises they had made to build a life that worked for both of them. "If you could go back," Pierce asked, "would you change anything?" Eleanor thought about it seriously. "I would have married you sooner," she said finally. "Not waited those 2 months. Every day with you has been a gift, and I wish I had more of them." "We have had 40 years," Pierce said. "That is more than most people get." "It is not enough," Eleanor said fiercely. "I want 40 more." Pierce laughed and pulled her close. "Then we will have to make every remaining day count." They did exactly that. Pierce lived to be 78, still strong and active, until a heart attack took him quickly one winter morning while he was chopping wood. He died doing what he loved, in the place he loved, surrounded by the family he had built with Eleanor. Eleanor followed him 3 years later, having lived long enough to see all her children settled and happy, her grandchildren starting their own families. She died peacefully in her sleep at the mountain cabin, and her children buried her beside Pierce on the overlook, where they had first admitted their love. The story of the stagecoach teacher and the mountain man who saved her became legend in Idaho, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy. But the truth was simpler and more profound than any legend. 2 people found each other against impossible odds, built a life together that honored both their strengths, and loved each other with a constancy that never wavered. They raised children who changed their world for the better, created institutions that served their community for generations, and proved that the strongest partnerships are built on mutual respect, genuine affection, and the courage to choose love, even when it is inconvenient or difficult. Their great-great-grandchildren still live in Idaho, still visit the cabin that Pierce built and Eleanor made into a home. The school Eleanor founded still operates, now named in her honor. Pierce's Guide Service has become a renowned outfitting company that protects the wilderness even as it introduces people to its wonders. And on the overlook above Wallace, where 2 people once sat and promised to build a life together, there is a simple marker: Pierce Whitman and Eleanor Zimmerman Whitman. They chose courage, they found love, they built legacy. 1854, 1932, and 1854, 1935. It is all the memorial they need because their real legacy lives on in the children they raised, the community they served, and the example they set of what marriage and partnership can be when 2 people truly see and value each other. They were not perfect, but they were perfectly matched, and that made all the difference.